This is the story of Donna Macho, a 19-year-old legal secretary, as well as a part-time model. Donna is described as beautiful and was quite popular in high school and college. She resided in the Cherrybrook Lane home in East Windsor, New Jersey. Donna was very hardworking and aspired to be a supermodel, and she was determined to turn her part-time modeling job into a full-time career. It seemed like any other Saturday night in 1984 to then 14-year-old Julie Macho. She arrived at her family's East Windsor home, saw her 19-year-old sister Donna's car parked outside, and went to the basement to hang out with her older sibling. They watched scary movies for hours until 2 a.m., when Julie went upstairs to bed on Cherrybrook Lane. It was the last time anyone from Donna Macho's family saw her alive. Their mother, Betty, and stepfather, Garland, were asleep upstairs. Berger said she never heard any commotion coming from the basement apartment. To this day, Berger doesn't know what happened that night, only that a decades-long nightmare began the following morning on February 26, 1984, when they realized Macho was gone and something was wrong. "The unknown is so destructive," Berger said, reflecting on a crime that not only took her sister, but contributed to the deaths of her mother, stepfather, and older sister Tony. "It destroyed my family. The searching, the looking, the wondering. I lost my family and I lost my future." Investigators soon found Macho's blood-stained car about a mile away, but 11 tortured years passed before her skeletal remains were discovered in April 1995. Wrapped in a carpet in a wooded area near a cranberry farm, not far from where the car was recovered. "We hired private investigators, trackers, psychics," Berger said of the family's effort to find the killer. "We spent all the money we had. We still thought that somehow, maybe she was still alive. Maybe she was just hurt, or somebody was holding her." New Jersey authorities announced in May of this year they had finally identified her killer after nearly 40 years of mystery. Advanced DNA analysis of semen found in Donna Macho's basement was matched to Nathaniel Harvey, a convicted killer who had spent time on New Jersey's death row and died in prison 3 years ago. Berger got a call months ago, informing her of the DNA match. Matthew Norden, an investigator with the Mercer County Prosecutor's Office, told her Harvey had been confirmed as her sister's killer. She said it brought her some measure of closure to erase the uncertainty after all these years. But anger soon followed. "I was relieved it was going to be closed, but so mad," Berger said. "Mad I didn't stay and help her fight. Mad he could invade our home so easily. Mad he was not in jail. Mad he was dead. He never had to pay for this." Harvey had been locked up since 1985, a year after Macho's killing, when he was charged with the rape and murder of a 37-year-old Plainsboro woman, Irene Schnaps. Over the years, Harvey had been questioned numerous times by police investigating the Macho murder. But there were other suspects as well. And Harvey's DNA tests in the 1980s and 90s had proven inconclusive. Harvey's attorney, Eric Kleiner, has long held that his client didn't kill anyone. And Harvey was still fighting his conviction in the Schnaps killing when he died in prison in November of 2020. Harvey stood trial in 1986 and was convicted of rape and murder in the Schnaps case. On appeal, Harvey claimed he was never given his Miranda rights when questioned by police, and the New Jersey Supreme Court overturned the conviction. In 1994, Harvey stood trial again and was convicted, then sentenced to death. New Jersey abolished the death penalty in 2007, and he appealed once again. The case eventually went to the state Supreme Court, which ordered new DNA testing, and in 2015, Harvey won the right to a third trial on the Schnaps murder. He was 70 and awaiting that trial when he died. Kleiner said this week he couldn't comment because he hadn't seen the DNA test results. Berger, however, said she is relieved that her sister's killer has finally been named. Harvey was living in East Windsor at the time that Macho disappeared. Authorities said he had worked at the farm where Macho's body was found. "When all is said and done, his DNA is there," she said, adding she knew Harvey had long been on a short list of suspects. "Then I can't see how it could be anyone else who did it. If the DNA is in our house, then he did it." Still questions remain about that fateful night. Was he in the house the whole time? When did he get in? "I just don't know," she said. What haunts her most, she said, is her belief that she could have stopped the killer. Berger said her sister was supposed to work at a law firm the Sunday she disappeared, so it wasn't surprising when she wasn't around the house in the day. But when she didn't come home for dinner, her mother grew worried and went downstairs to check the apartment. Berger said there were things were strewn in about Donna's normally tidy apartment. Clear signs there had been a struggle. When her mother found a pile of blood-stained clothes, she called police. Berger said the trauma took an immediate toll on the family. Her stepfather died 6 months after Donna disappeared. She moved to Texas with her mother in 1987, but their storage unit was promptly burglarized, and all their possessions, including the family photos, mementos, and 16 boxes of files regarding the investigation, were stolen. Her mother died in 1990, and her older sister, Toni, died a few years later. They died before Donna's body was discovered. "There's something worse than death, and that's a missing child," Berger said. "When you have missing child, there's no moving on." Berger said she promised her mother on her deathbed that she would stay on the case, and in the later 1990s, she reached out to Harvey's attorney, hoping to talk to the man. "I said, 'Let me talk to him,' but he wouldn't let me do that," she said. In Texas, Berger said she gradually rebuilt her life, got married and raised 3 kids, while always hoping for a break in the case. Now, 54 years old, she's a grandmother and an elected official who serves on council in the town of New Fairview, where she lives. Berger said she periodically would check in with law enforcement in New Jersey to see if there were any new developments in the case. She's also kept in touch with people in East Windsor through the Heightstown High Memorial page on Facebook to keep the investigation alive. "I'm glad the case is closed, and it was him," she said. "But I feel he got away with it." With the investigation over, Berger was finally able to obtain her sister's remains. She was now able to give her sister a proper burial in the family niche. Nearly 35 years after his estranged wife was found dead in the trunk of a car, a 68-year-old man from Oregon has been formally charged with her murder, authorities said. Robert Elmer Atrops was arrested at his Newburgh home on March 2 and charged with 1 count of second-degree murder in connection with the 1988 death of 30-year-old Deborah Lee Atrops, according to a press release from the Washington County District Attorney's Office. In November 1988, Deborah Lee Atrops was reported missing by her husband, then 34-year-old Robert, the release states. Though still married, the couple had separated 5 months earlier and were living together in a Salem apartment with their then 8-month-old daughter. On November 29, 1988, Robert went to pick up the couple's child from a babysitter in Newburgh, while Deborah was at a hair appointment in Tigard. Deborah was reportedly expected to be at the home before 8 p.m., but never showed up. Robert then called several friends and family members to see if they knew where Deborah was, before reporting her missing to the Tigard Police Department, authorities said. The next day, November 30, 1988, he told investigators he still had not heard from his wife. Deborah's car was then entered into databases used by law enforcement as a vehicle connected to a missing person. Deborah's black Honda Accord was reportedly recovered by police officers in Beaverton on December 1, 1988, after a city public works employee reported a suspicious abandoned car with keys in the driver's seat. The 2-door sedan also had its driver's side window down and was missing license plates, authorities said. Police said they found Mrs. Atrops' body inside the car trunk, and it appeared she had been placed there after her death due to the position of her body. Witnesses said they saw the car there in the early morning of November 30, 1988. An autopsy on December 2, 1988, reported that Mrs. Atrops had been physically assaulted and strangled to death. Despite more than 3 decades of investigation, the case eventually went cold. The Washington County District Attorney's Office Cold Case Multidisciplinary Unit reopened the case in 2021. The release states, after receiving a grant from the U.S. Department of Justice, the Cold Case Unit was established in 2020 in partnership with the Washington County Sheriff's Office. For the next year and a half, investigators said they re-interviewed multiple witnesses and had forensic evidence re-examined. The charge against Robert was eventually brought forward on February 28. The grand jury indicted Robert Atrops on 1 count of murder in the 2nd degree. On Thursday, March 2nd, a search warrant was served at Atrops' Newburgh home, and he was taken into custody without incident to the Washington County Jail. "28 years ago, the body of an elderly woman was found dead in her East Greenbush apartment. Wilhelmina Filkins, known to her friends and family as Violet, was found dead in her East Greenbush apartment by her brother Sterling and niece Carol on August 19, 1994. Authorities believe Filkins was killed 2 days earlier during a robbery. Autopsy results show that Filkins died from several blows to the back of her head. 3 years after Filkins was found dead, authorities found personal property belonging to Filkins behind a cemetery along State Route 203 in the village of Nassau. Troopers say the woman lived alone, but was well liked by her neighbors. Authorities say they believed whoever killed Filkins used her car, a white 4-door Plymouth Reliant, to the area to dump some of the stolen property. Back in 2019, police received a tip that sent them to Rosendale, New York. A fingerprint match and a recent tip identified Jeremiah Guyette as the alleged suspect in the death of Wilhelmina Violet Filkins. Police in East Greenbush, south of Albany, said Guyette, who served in the Air Force in Florida and also drove a bus for elderly people, was interviewed after the killing, but never considered a person of interest. East Greenbush Police Detective Sergeant Michael Guadagnino told reporters. An ex-girlfriend later tipped authorities off to Guyette, saying he began crying when he told her he'd robbed a woman and hit her. Guadagnino said, "This can't be true," the ex-girlfriend recalled him saying, according to Guadagnino. "I'm sure she's fine." On October 1, 2019, when Guadagnino and a New York State Police investigator tried to talk to Guyette about the killing, he became defensive and visibly upset, Guadagnino said. Guyette declined to talk with authorities without a lawyer. The next morning, authorities found him dead in the garage of his home in Rosendale, nearly 70 miles south of East Greenbush, Guadagnino said. An autopsy found Guyette took his own life. Investigators then resubmitted all the physical evidence from the original case, including a wooden coffee table with an unknown fingerprint, not knowing if anything would match Guyette. 3 years later, after COVID strained the state crime lab and delayed forensic findings, the fingerprint was determined to match Guyette's left thumb. A tip from a family member last year confirmed Guyette's involvement, Guadagnino said. On October 1, 2019, the same day authorities approached Guyette, he called her in a panic and said he didn't want to go to prison. Guyette told the relative that when he was younger, he planned to rob a bank and steal a car to get money for college. The family member told authorities. Someone had died, but he didn't want to talk anymore over the phone, Guadagnino said. The relative made arrangements for Guyette to meet with a lawyer, a fact authorities confirmed with the attorney. During the news conference, Filkins' niece, Carol Filkins, thanked authorities and recalled her aunt as a simple woman who lived quietly and never would have envisioned anything like this happening. "We're all very thankful it has been resolved," she said. For Sharon Henderson, bringing the killer of her daughter, Nikki Allan, to justice has been an all-consuming, personally ruinous, 3-decade mission. While there was still breath in my body, I would never have stopped until the man who killed Nikki was found, she said. She was last seen skipping to keep up with Boyd, who was a neighbor and her babysitter's boyfriend, as he walked towards the old Exchange building. She disappeared on the night of 7 October with her battered and blood-stained body found in the basement of the nearby old Exchange building the following morning. Nothing mattered more in my life than seeing justice for her. Over these 30 years, I have been through hell. I fought against problems with alcohol, and I've been sectioned in a psychiatric hospital. But I knew I'd get him. One way or another, however long it took, I'd see him locked up. That man was David Boyd, who, for reasons that will never be fully known, battered her head with a brick, rolled up her t-shirt, and stabbed her 37 times. He dragged her body down cellar steps to try to hide her. Local man George Herron fell under police scrutiny, confessing to the crime after 3 days of questioning. But that confession was ruled inadmissible in court due to harsh interrogation tactics, and Mr. Herron was acquitted of Nikki's murder, granted a new identity, and relocated from Sunderland. Henderson says her life has been taken away. I've become estranged from most of my family through this. It's taken over my life. I spent many years drinking to dangerous levels because of this. And since Nikki's death, I've been admitted to psychiatric care. Nikki's family and her killer all lived on the Garths, run-down and now demolished blocks of 1930s maisonettes in Sunderland's East End, near the docks. Henderson's search for Nikki's killer began with trying to track down any man who lived on the estate whom she had suspicions about. To help her memory, she drew out a map of the block and tried to eliminate each in turn. Eventually, only one person was left. She said, David Boyd. At the time, he was using the surname Smith and also Bell, so no one knew his true identity. Henderson said Boyd, then in his mid-20s, was a friend of her sister's partner, but she had never been able to find anything about his earlier life. He was a young man then, but a loner. The only time I can remember seeing him was when he was out on the veranda in front of the flats on his floor. I don't remember speaking to him. He was there during the police search for Nikki and always hanging around, but after Nikki's death, he left the Garth. She went on a mission to track him down. I made it my business to become friends with his girlfriend and her daughter, and I even moved to Ryhope, a former pit village on the outskirts of Sunderland, to be near them. I wanted to be close to them and find out what they knew about who and where he was. I just knew he had something to do with it. Boyd was spoken to by police as a witness, but never treated as a suspect at the time. A DNA profile matching his was found on Nikki's clothes in 2017 when a new team of detectives reopened the case. She said she had been haunted by relentless nightmares, adding, I kept saying to Nikki that I will not let you down, because I've let you down once and I have to live without you. The judge said Nikki's murder had shocked and bewildered the community of Hendon, in the East End of Sunderland, for 31 years. And as time passed, Boyd would have thought with some relief that he had got away with it. However, the science of DNA had also advanced in the decades since the murder, which allowed detectives to match samples from Nikki's clothes to her killer. Mrs. Justice Lambert said under current rules she would have jailed Boyd for a minimum of 37 years, but she had to comply with the sentencing regulations in 1992, which suggested a lesser sentence, albeit one well in excess of 20 years. Speaking after sentencing, Nikki's mother, Sharon Henderson, 57, said she was absolutely devastated by the sentence, which she labeled a disgrace, adding Boyd should have been jailed for life without the possibility of parole. Nikki's father, David Allan, said he was 28 when Nikki was murdered, and from that night my life changed. In a statement, he said he felt anger and hatred towards the killer, and would never be able to forgive the man responsible. Mr. Allan said the devastation he felt was indescribable because Boyd had lived his life for 30 years, whilst Nikki did not get to live hers. The court had heard Boyd was a neighbor of Nikki's in the Waregarth flats. He knew how to navigate the old exchange building and had sexual fantasies about young girls. He also had 22 convictions for 45 offenses, including sexual crimes. In 1986, he exposed himself to a woman. He later told a psychiatrist he had been doing it since the age of 16 and couldn't control the urge. That same year, he was convicted of breaching the peace in Sacriston, County Durham, when he grabbed a 10-year-old girl in a park and tried to kiss her. In 1997, he admitted to police he exposed himself to 3 teenage girls, but was not charged. 2 years later, he groped a 9-year-old girl in a park in Stockton and confessed to a probation officer that he had dirty thoughts and sexual fantasies about young girls. In mitigation, Jason Pitter, for the defense, said Boyd had a history of mental illness, learning difficulties, and an IQ level in the bottom 2% of the population. However, the judge dismissed that as irrelevant because he used sufficient guile to lure Nikki away from her home and was quick to cover his tracks by conjuring a false alibi. She said there was no guarantee Boyd would be released from prison, and it would be up to the parole board to decide. Vicki Johnson's body was found back in January 1991 by investigators at a park on Darwin Street and H Place in Seaside. Police said she was strangled and that her body was set on fire. There were no leads on a suspect, as there were no witnesses to the crime. The case went unsolved for more than 32 years until the State Department of Justice Crime Laboratory found a DNA match underneath Johnson's fingernails matching a man named Frank Lewis McClure. The victim, Vicki Johnson, 34, managed to put up a fight, getting Frank Lewis McClure's DNA under her fingernails. It is an answer, though it is too late to charge the suspect. McClure died at the age of 77 in 2021. Johnson, a mother of 3, was found dead at a horrific scene in the playground area of Sabato Park on January 3, 1991. Seaside is located just east of Monterey, around 115 miles south of San Francisco. Miss Johnson suffered a violent death. She had been strangled, suffocated, and set on fire. Miss Johnson's death shocked the Seaside community due to the details of the brutality. In those days, there was a lot of gang violence, but this one shocked everyone. Seaside Police Chief Nick Borges told Fox News. She wasn't associated with gangs, and to be killed the way that she was. He said that the crack epidemic was insane out here back then. Dealers of the region were exclusively from Seaside and prevalent until the early 2000s. Borges said it is not like that anymore, but he noted the city's somber legacy. It was a violent community. There was a sentiment back then that victims of murder there did not really matter, he said. And to me, that's unacceptable. Every life matters, and we've got to give people justice. Investigators with the Cold Case Task Force, led by the Monterey County District Attorney's Office, reopened the case. They submitted more evidence to the California Department of Justice for DNA testing. It took 2 years for testing because of backlogs and lack of staffing, Borg said. It's really sad. It ties into my frustration with cold cases in general. He voiced frustration with the slow pace of solving the case. He noted that the DNA technology in question is not new. He became chief in August 2021. He added that this testing could have been done 10 years ago. He acknowledged that agencies become overwhelmed with new cases. But he noted a lack of a national standard under which to periodically review unsolved murders. He suggested legislation. We can never allow murders to fall off, he said. Investigators eventually got answers regarding Johnson's death and identified McClure as the suspect. Borges said they managed to identify the suspect because of the DNA under Johnson's fingernails. Evidence clearly demonstrates Mrs. Johnson put up an incredible physical battle against McClure and fought until the last moments of her life. McClure left significant DNA underneath Mrs. Johnson's fingernails, which could only be a result of Mrs. Johnson fighting vigorously for her life. McClure's criminal history dates back to 1990 for crimes, including battery, causing serious bodily injury, and resisting police, the chief stated. The suspect violated probation in 1994 by committing assault with a deadly weapon and domestic violence, and was sentenced to 4 years in prison. In 1991, the year of the murder, McClure committed assault with a deadly weapon and domestic violence, the chief said. Indeed, domestic violence cases were his most common charges, with incidents from 1990, the aforementioned 1991 case, 94, 99, and the most recent in 2011. He has been to prison for assaults with deadly weapons and domestic violence against women, but nothing that rose to the level that would alarm or alert us that this guy would be engaged with murder, Borges told Fox. He was pretty well known in the community, not so much as a great person, but his family was well known, and everyone was fairly surprised. What remains unknown is how Johnson and McClure knew each other, or if they even knew each other at all. Officers also do not know the motive. That's the mystery here, Borges said. Seaside is a small community. Borges suggested that there is a high probability that the victim and the killer would have known of each other at a minimum. The only real link between them is that they both dabbled in illegal drugs, he said. It's really difficult because he's dead, so we may never know. Nonetheless, the investigation is ongoing. Borges voiced hope that someone who knew McClure may step forward the truth. He had to have told somebody what he did, and hopefully that person comes forward. On June 4, 2006, hikers discovered a decomposing body a few miles from Lyons in the South St. Vrain Canyon. Deputies and detectives discovered that the female body appeared to have been pulled from a shallow grave by a predator. Because of the condition of the woman's body, investigators were unable to identify her by her fingerprints. A Boulder man has been arrested in Alaska in connection with a cold case murder dating back to 2006. This is the second time John Angerer has been arrested for the murder of Angela Wilds. Wilds' body was found by hikers in the South St. Vrain Canyon in 2006, about 3.3 miles outside of Lyons in unincorporated Boulder County. Her body was nude except for a cross ring on her left hand. Investigators said the body appeared to have been dragged from a nearby shallow grave, presumably by a large predator. Deputies located a pair of yellow ski pants, a sleeping bag, a pillow in a pillowcase, all neatly folded near the grave. Investigators said there was no information that identified the victim, and she remained unidentified for months. In November of 2006, DNA confirmed the woman's identity as Wilds, who would have been 38 years old. John was initially arrested in 2010, but then released when a judge determined there wasn't enough evidence to link him to the crime. Since then, investigators with the Boulder County Sheriff's Office and the District Attorney's Office have continued to work on the case, including interviewing new witnesses, re-interviewing individuals, consulting with forensic pathologists, and submitting items to the Colorado Bureau of Investigating for testing and DNA analysis. The chief pathologist for the Boulder County Coroner's Office testified at Angerer's probable cause, hearing that there was no evidence in Wilds' autopsy to support a homicide finding. Rather, the pathologist said she had a blocked artery, which meant that she could have died from a heart attack. They need to produce evidence first that Angerer is the person who caused the death of another, public defender Seth Temin said at that hearing. They haven't done that, Judge. They can't even place him at the scene of the death, nor can they say how or where she died. In the end, Boulder County Judge Thomas Reed decided he wanted an appellate court to wrestle with the issue that if there is absolutely no evidence of the cause of death, can a pathologist determine what was most likely the cause of death? The defense attorney lauded the judge's call. "We think this is the right decision," Timeen reportedly said after the ruling. "There is no evidence of whether this was a homicide or, if so, who might have done it. That's a fundamental issue in a murder case." In the years that passed, investigators continued their work in determining how Wilds died and who may have done it. They apparently got the same answer by way of the identification of new witnesses, re-interviewing individuals previously known to law enforcement, consulting with other forensic pathologists, and submitting further items to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation for testing and DNA analysis. Specifics about the new evidence were not released. John Anger was arrested on March 9th in Anchorage. His extradition to Colorado is currently pending. Boulder County Sheriff Curtis Johnson stated, "I am glad that we were able to move our investigation into the homicide of Angela Wilds forward. I am proud that our detectives didn't give up on this cold case. We know Angela's family has been waiting a long time for this day to come. Her family is in our thoughts as we take the next steps in the judicial process." A Long Island cold case more than 4 decades old has finally been cracked, and the identity of the killer is now known. In the kitchen of her Rhode Island apartment, Irene Wilkowitz braced for what the detectives had come to tell her. The last time police had arrived at her door, she was 17, and they told her they'd found her sister's body. Eve, 20, had been kidnapped, raped, and strangled after taking a late-night train home from Manhattan, where she worked as a secretary at a publishing house, on March 22, 1980. Her body was left in a yard near her apartment in Bay Shore, New York, on Long Island's South Shore. That was 42 years ago. Wilkowitz had since gone to college, worked, married, raised 2 children, divorced, and moved away from Long Island, always in fear that the killer would one day come for her, wondering if they'd ever catch him. She became Eve's last advocate, emailing detectives for updates every few weeks and urging them to try an investigative technique involving DNA that has recently helped crack hundreds of cold cases around the country. The detectives told her they were trying. Now, waiting for their news, she tried not to expect too much. She couldn't bear more disappointment. She took a deep breath. "We identified the person responsible for the death of your sister, Eve," Suffolk County Police Detective Jeffrey Batari said. Wilkowitz's legs began shaking. She hugged her son, Evan, 25, named in Eve's memory. "I started crying because I never thought I'd hear those words," Wilkowitz recalled. His name was Herbert Rice. He died of cancer in 1991, with 2 sons who had no idea what he'd done, Batari said. In the sweeping and exhaustive investigation of the murder, in which police canvassed dozens of streets and interviewed hundreds of people, Rice had never attracted suspicion. He had a short record of arrests for non-violent offenses, which did not require him to provide a DNA sample that would have been put in criminal databases. A query for relatives in the criminal database, known as a familial DNA search, failed as well. It was the new technology, known as genetic genealogy, that finally gave police the answer. Without DNA, this wouldn't have ever been solved, Suffolk County District Attorney Raymond Tierney said. But for Wilkowitz, knowing who killed her sister won't repair 4 decades of terror, anxiety, and loss. For 42 years, this was all I wanted. I just wanted it to be over, Wilkowitz said. My goal was to be a mom, and beyond that, I didn't allow myself to dream any other dream, because I was afraid someone would come along and murder me. So I can't process that it's solved now, and that I'm still here. Eve was Wilkowitz's only sibling. Their mother died of cancer before Eve's death, and their father died in 2010. leaving Irene as the last family member who could speak on Eve's behalf. On anniversaries of her death, she did interviews with local media, a way to keep Long Island from forgetting. She wasn't famous. She wasn't a celebrity. She was my sister, and she matters, Wilkowitz said. In 2018, Wilkowitz's son told her about a new investigative technique authorities in California had used to identify the serial rapist and murderer, known as the Golden State Killer. Police had entered crime scene DNA into consumer DNA databases, including GADmatch, Family Tree DNA, and MyHeritage, and traced the family tree back to a former police officer. The case was the first use of genetic genealogy to solve a violent crime. It led to a surge of interest in the method and spawned a mini-industry of private labs working with genetic genealogists to re-examine decades-old crimes. But the tactic also raised concerns among privacy advocates who feared government misuse of people's personal data, and some states were hesitant to allow its use. In January 2019, Wilkowitz contacted the most famous of the genetic genealogists, Cece Moore, and asked for her help. Moore told Wilkowitz that she couldn't get involved because New York didn't yet allow the technique. The State Department of Health required private labs to obtain a permit to do such work, a rigorous process that can take months or years, and had not granted permission to any lab. The Department of Health has since granted permits to 2 companies to perform genetic genealogy for police in New York. Wilkowitz pleaded with Suffolk County Police Lieutenant Kevin Bearer, a homicide investigator who oversaw Eve's case, to find a way. He, too, was frustrated that he could not try genetic genealogy. But in December 2019, Suffolk County authorities came up with a workaround. They asked the New York Department of Health to let them send DNA from semen found on Eve's body to the FBI. The FBI had helped with the original 1980 investigation and was not restricted by New York laws. The state and the FBI agreed, and in July 2021, an FBI agent specializing in genetic genealogy told Suffolk County detectives she'd found a distant relative of the unknown suspect, along with a last name, Rice. Working on that information, detectives landed on Herbert Rice, who was long dead. Unable to get a DNA sample to confirm their theory, they tracked down one of his sons. After failing to collect a DNA sample from him covertly, Batari, the detective, knocked on the son's door and told him what they were trying to do. The son said he hadn't been close to his father and allowed the detective to swab his cheek, Batari said. The DNA sample verified in late August that the son's father was the killer. Batari told the son and his mother, who filled in more of the story. At the time of the murder, the son's mother said she had kicked Rice out of their house, according to detectives. He had moved in with his mother, who lived about 4 houses from the yard where Eve Wilkowitz's body was discovered on March 25, 1980, detectives said. In the case file, detectives saw that his mother had been questioned by police, who canvassed the neighborhood. She told them she hadn't noticed anything, Batari said. The son had done nothing wrong, but he told detectives he still wished he could apologize to Wilkowitz's family, police said. The son could not immediately be reached for comment. The son's mother declined to comment. On December 6th, Batari and a sergeant from the homicide unit visited Irene Wilkowitz in Rhode Island to tell her what they'd found. Wilkowitz, who works as a nanny, shares an apartment with her son because she remains afraid to live alone. Knowing the chances of a breakthrough were slim, she thought that the detectives were probably coming to say they'd hit a final dead end. She introduced them to Evan and made small talk while Batari used FaceTime to patch in the FBI agent who'd done the genealogical investigation. These are the most exciting kinds of visits we can do, to give a family some sort of answer, Batari said. Especially for her. We had decades of detectives who worked on this. Wilkowitz cried in her son's arms, while the detectives gave her Herbert's name and birth date. They told her how they'd figured it out. It amazed her. She thanked the detectives, and after about 30 minutes, they left. Wilkowitz leaned against her kitchen island for a while, crying. Still shaking, she called Bearer and thanked him. Wilkowitz said she was open to talking to Herbert's son. Batari tried connecting them. The son has told detectives he is considering it. "I just want to say thank you," Wilkowitz said, "and how sorry I feel for him and his family to know that a family member is responsible for a crime like this. And they have to live knowing that. It's horrible for them as well." Before announcing the case was solved, Suffolk County authorities wanted to make sure they had the right man. So they got a search warrant to exhume Herbert's body. The results came back March 23rd, nearly 42 years to the day Eve went missing. The samples taken from the remains matched the suspect's DNA, Batari said. "It was him. There is no way we would have gotten to where we are today had it not been for science and genetic genealogy to let us dig deep, find family members, and get us to Mr. Rice," Suffolk County Police Commissioner Rodney Harrison said. Bearer praised Wilkowitz for keeping attention on the search for the killer. "She deserves the credit, and I think she's the star in this case," Bearer said. The case is now closed, but Wilkowitz still suffers from the trauma of losing her sister and of going decades not knowing who killed her. She still has questions that will never be answered. "I can't ask him anything. Why did he do it? Why did he pick on an innocent, beautiful woman who was just walking home?" Wilkowitz said. "There are no real answers, no reason why. She wants to find a way to continue being a voice for her sister, and maybe for the families of other victims whose cases remain cold. To say there is always hope. Her sister wasn't just a story told and retold in the media. She was a real person," Wilkowitz said. "She was outgoing, had lots of friends, loved horses, loved music, liked to read and write and draw. And she liked to be a big sister to me. I want people to know that." A Florida man who was arrested in connection to the cold case murder of a convenience store manager who was stabbed 73 times nearly 3 decades ago was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison in August of this year. Kenneth Stowe was convicted by an Orange County jury of first-degree murder with a weapon in the death of Terrance Paquette after a 5-day trial. Paquette was supposed to open the store by 6 that morning, officials said. 2 men from an armored car company were there to pick up a cash deposit from the business, but the door was locked. Deputies got keys to the business after one of Paquette's co-workers, who closed shop the night before, drove by, saw authorities, and let them inside with his keys. Paquette was found dead the morning of February 3rd, 1996, inside the bathroom of the Lil Champ convenience store in northwest Orange County. Pools of blood stained the floor and walls in photos shown by the sheriff's office after the 2021 arrest of the then 54-year-old Stowe. The cash deposit from the store was also missing. Orange County Sheriff John Mina told reporters at a press conference following Stowe's arrest after DNA from a discarded can of beer linked him to the cold case that the scene was very gruesome. Paquette, 31, was the sole employee of the store. Deputies were initially called to the scene after someone noticed the lights were out, even though the store was usually open at the time. Once inside, deputies found Paquette dead from 73 stab wounds. Investigators said blood from Stowe was found throughout the store, including the freezer door, freezer flap, the lottery machine, and the key cylinder and push bar of the entry and exit door. The killer injured himself during the attack and moved around to various parts of the store before fleeing the scene, authorities said. The killer stole Paquette's keys and locked the business after stealing about $1,000 from the safe under the cash register, deputies said. Despite the evidence collected from the scene, investigators lacked the technology then to create a DNA profile and identify a suspect. A detective closed the case on September 29, 1997. Pending further leads. Another investigator reopened it on July 22, 2003, re-interviewing witnesses and taking buccal swabs to compare to the suspect's blood. There were no matches. There were also no matches when an analyst put the unknown DNA profile from the freezer door handle into the combined DNA index database on March 17, 2003. At the time of the killing, there was no way to make an arrest based on blood evidence without comparing it to another blood sample, Mina said. The case went cold and remained that way until 2021, when a droplet of blood recovered from the handle of the store freezer was discovered. It was tested by forensic genealogists with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement and determined the blood came from one of 3 brothers. A DNA sample submitted was determined to be a relative of Stowe's parents. He had worked at the convenience store for some time before Paquette and lived in an apartment across the street from him in 1996. Investigators surveilled Stowe and collected DNA from a bag of discarded beer cans, which linked him to the killing. Authorities in Florida have announced they will finally be able to close a cold case murder dating back to 1993 after DNA proved a link to a long-term suspect. Roslin Kruse was just 23 and had last been seen getting into the car of an unknown person on November 1, 1993. Her body was discovered shortly afterwards on the shoulder of East Bay Road in Gibsonton, Florida, which is about 10 miles south of the city center, with an autopsy subsequently revealing she had been strangled to death. It seemed investigators were swiftly making progress when the car was traced to a home in Tampa, and a man named Michael Rizzo admitted to picking Roslin up in his vehicle on the day she died, although he insisted she was alive when he left her. Frustratingly, though, there was nothing concrete to tie Rizzo to the victim, even though his home was less than a mile from the deposition site. His girlfriend gave a conflicting story to his alibi, and he failed a polygraph examination, even though the early investigation showed that he had picked her up on the day of the killing. Rizzo claimed to have dropped her off alive and denied involvement in Kruse's death. And even though a polygraph exam taken at the time indicated deception in his responses, conflicting information from Rizzo's wife and girlfriend at the time further complicated the investigation, according to the sheriff. Ultimately, despite all this circumstantial evidence, detectives were unable to prove their suspicions, and the case slowly went cold. Authorities collected and stored forensic evidence related to the case, including an unknown DNA sample taken from Kruse's body at the time, which did not yield any matches until November 2021. At the time, investigators collected a DNA swab from Rizzo's biological daughter, which matched the DNA profile taken from Kruse's body. Detectives with the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office met with Kruse's relatives after determining the discovery provided a pivotal lead in the case. Investigators verified that Rizzo died on March 1, 2011, in Orange County, Florida, without ever admitting to his crime. This investigation demonstrates the commitment of our cold case investigators to bring justice to victims and their families, no matter how much time has passed, said Sheriff Chad Chronister. We extend our deepest condolences to Miss Kruse's family, and we hope the resolution of this case can provide them with some closure. The investigation has been officially closed by the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office. Authorities in New Mexico have solved a cold case murder dating back nearly 4 decades after funding was provided for DNA testing. Donna Sue Hyatt was last seen alive on a July evening in 1987, with witnesses saying they spotted her leaving a store in Carlsbad with a tall Caucasian male at around 9:15 p.m. When Donna's daughter returned to the family home they shared on Elm Street at around 11:40 p.m., she came upon a terrible scene. Donna lay dead, having been sexually assaulted, stabbed, and strangled. Although investigators followed up as many leads as they possibly could never identify the mysterious man or work out why Donna might have been with him that fateful night. Crime scene technicians collected and preserved the evidence from inside the Elm Street home, but with forensic science in its infancy, there was little that could be gleaned from it. Slowly, the case went cold. Carlsbad police have announced they have been working with a laboratory specializing in DNA technology, and that they have identified a suspect in Donna's killing. They said DNA collected from the 1987 crime scene matches that taken from the exhumed body of a man named Michael Ruff Wigley. What's more, interviews have ascertained that Wigley was in Carlsbad at the time of the murder. During the follow-up investigation, Detective Landgraf and Detective Nice learned Michael Ruff Wigley was investigated in the early 1980s for 2 separate incidents of sexual assault cases in Central Texas. Wigley was charged and convicted in one of those incidents in Texas and was consequently sentenced to prison. Detectives eventually discovered after Wigley was released from prison, he passed away in a traffic accident in 1989. If you enjoyed the video, please show your support by subscribing and liking the video, and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any future uploads.